Okay. All right, Sister Pat, I think we have everyone for now.
Great. And if anybody has a question as I am going through the slide presentation, please put it in the chat box, and I think I can see it there. I'm not sure, but I might see it. And then we will have plenty of time for comments and questions at the end, particularly because this is a smaller group. The last time we did this the other day, actually the people's comments were really good and helpful and helped to bring this alive. So Kim, if you move it to the next slide, this is just telling you why we're going to be doing this. And so we can move right ahead to the next one, which is the quote from Pope Francis. All of you are in various kinds of positions of leadership in mercy institutions. And today, it seems more than ever, we are faced with tremendous challenges, partly because of the speed of life, because of the speed of communication. Social media certainly does not help, I don't think, us to be able to make careful decisions. But shortly after Pope Francis was elected, I found this quote from him, and I was particularly taken with it because, as you know, he is a Jesuit, and so he is steeped in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. He was novice director of the Jesuits, so he taught discernment to the young Jesuits under his care, and then he also was provincial of the Jesuit community. So this is an organization that really prides themselves on discernment. But he said, "I'm wary of decisions made hastily. I am always wary of the first decision. That is the first thing that comes to my mind if I have to make a decision. This is usually the wrong thing. I have to wait and assess, looking deeply into myself, taking the necessary time." And I think we've seen this played out. Sometimes even people have criticized him at times when the press particularly wants an instantaneous response from him, and he really is taking time for consultation and, I believe, for prayer before he comes to some kind of a decision. The next slide is from a purely secular point of view. This writer, Malcolm Gladwell, is an American writer. He's a really interesting and brilliant writer, I think. He's a man who is biracial and is comfortable, I would say, in different cultures. And he has written several wonderful books, bestsellers, one called The Tipping Point, which was how group opinion changes. But this particular book, Blink, he's talking about sort of looking at the way we think and the way we make decisions. And so one of the things he says, the key to a good decision making is not knowledge, it is understanding. We are swimming in the former. And that part is so true because of this information age, because of things like Wikipedia. We can look something up, and sometimes, depending upon the source, it may or may not be really a substantive response. But we can look things up and get answers very, very quickly. But as he says, we are desperately lacking in understanding. So it seems that the more information that comes at us, sometimes the less we fully understand. Then he goes on later and speaks in terms of what is referred to as insight. And this is, I consider insight something that is both intellectual as well as spiritual. So certainly in spiritual writing, even some of the saints talk about spiritual insight into certain realities. But Gladwell says insight is not a light bulb that goes off inside of our heads. It's not like, okay, push the button and there it is. It is instead a flickering candle that can easily be snuffed out. And that is one of the reasons why I believe that a discernment process is really helpful in the kind of decision making at a higher level, and also only in important things. You don't use an ethical discernment process for every decision possible, but you certainly use it for some. All right, the next one. So why is this important? Well, it's important because we're mission-based organizations. We try, and I use that word endeavor, we try to make decisions consistent with the organization's principles and values. All of us are human, and so sometimes we fail in that, and we need to be honest and transparent about that when we do, and continue to move forward so that we consistently try to do the good thing and that which is consistent with our mercy values. Our decisions, we claim as faith-based organizations that our decisions are based on faith. And another reason, I think, frankly, these last two, I believe that discernment, I've worked in healthcare, as Kim said, I worked in healthcare really for 30 years. And healthcare is a ministry of the church, but it is also a business. And I have come to realize that ethical discernment is really good business because it engages various stakeholders in the process of decision making. And this, first of all, it's consistent with Catholic Church teaching with regard to subsidiarity and participation. So if we really respect our workers, our co-workers or colleagues, we engage them in discernment. But the other reason that I think it's really smart and that good leaders engage in this is because discernment fosters greater buy-in then from the various stakeholders. If I have been involved even in a tangential way in a decision, then I'm more likely to say, okay, I will support this decision. I'm going to go along because my opinion really counted. Okay, the next one. The foundations, the Sisters of Mercy, and I think you've received this hopefully when you receive the slide presentation for this evening, but it is important that the Sisters of Mercy began working on this even before Mesa itself was formally founded. And there were a group of sisters that worked together, and we were a kind of a disparate group of some of us scholars, some people, thank God, who had feet on the ground. And those people tried to lay out what we believed were the foundations for the kinds of decision making that we do in mercy institutions. So the first thing that we talk about is gospel values, rooted in the gospel of Jesus Christ and in the life of Jesus. We also talked about the Catholic social teaching, which goes back. It is not just teaching in the modern era, but this goes back really to Old Testament times and then continues. We talked about Catholic moral teaching, and that's dynamic and it is ongoing. And Catholic moral teaching is not what you find, let's say, in the New York Times or even the National Catholic Reporter or other journals, but it's the official teaching of the magisterium of the church. And lots of times this is refined on certain topics as our world continues to become more complex. And then lastly, but certainly not least, are our mercy documents, the constitutions of the Sisters of Mercy, in some cases the letters of Catherine Macaulay, as well as the critical concerns of the Sisters of Mercy. But I don't want to say the critical concerns always come first. The critical concerns have only come after many years of other mercy documents. So these are the foundations. But the other thing that is important for you to remember, that's, you can go ahead, Kim, yeah, thanks, is that when we are called together to make, to engage in a discernment process, or if you as a leader have to make a decision for your institution, then the first thing you've got to do is your homework. And this is another reason, going back to Pope Francis, I think, why it takes time, because you need to gather the facts. And the facts are, as you know, never come to you from just one person. Particularly if this is something that involves a student or a teacher, or maybe more than one student or teacher, there are various interpretations of what really happened. And you need to listen to those voices to try to elicit and to understand what is the real story here. I used to say that in healthcare ethics, whenever I would have an ethics consultation, there was always, you'd begin and talk, and you could lay out pretty well the facts of the case by the clinical reality. But the other important thing was that I learned very early on that there's always the story underneath the story. And so you really need to listen with both your ears and your heart. In even doing a consultation, you need to gather the right people together. And I'll talk a little bit more about consultation and who are the kinds of people that you should call together as you are going through a discernment, or even when we do ethics consultation, who's present at the ethics consultation. And then you need to consult people, experts, as appropriate. I get daily news feeds mostly about healthcare, and there was just a little piece in there again today that the Trump administration is trying to come out with some kind of a statement, or basically trying to define transgender. And I laughed when I read it, because I thought, this is not for a civic administration to make a definition of what is transgender. This cannot be done without consulting physicians, and in some cases these are specialists. They're not just gender identity people, they are endocrinologists, psychiatrists. We need to consult psychologists and developmental psychologists. So we need to consult persons as appropriate for the particular issue at hand. Now, we also need to be, all right, you can move it on, Kim, thanks. We need to be people of virtue. And the primary virtue I'm going to talk about is the virtue of prudence. And any of you who were raised Catholic and are of a certain age where you may have been exposed to catechism, whether it was the Baltimore Catechism or the Catechism of the Catholic Church, know that there's a section where they talk about virtues, and the primary virtues are the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. But then immediately after those, and sort of supporting them, are what are called the four cardinal virtues. And they are prudence, justice, fortitude or courage, and temperance. And the only one that I want to talk about here is the virtue of prudence, because I think that as leaders, we really need to try to develop this in ourselves. And I will say to you, I mean, personally, this is not a virtue that I was born with. From the time I was really little, my parents told me that I began talking very young, and I pretty much said what I was thinking. And it took me many, many years to learn that is not a prudent thing to do. You have to learn to be quiet and listen and weigh what you want to say, so that, number one, you don't offend other people, and number two, you don't get yourself in trouble, which is really what I did more often. So as I began to study moral theology, I was very interested in this virtue and began to look at how was this virtue set forth way back even in medieval and Renaissance times. And in those days, because most Catholics couldn't read, or many could not read, much of our religious teaching came through religious art. So I found that there were a lot of statues of prudence as a virtue. Just as if you think in terms of justice, we always see justice as a woman holding a scale and trying to ensure that things are even. Well, prudence was depicted usually as a female, almost always as a female. But I chose this statue because I like it in particular because one of the faces, the face on the left, and this is one person with one head, but her faces going in both directions. So the face on the left is the face of a woman. And the face in the back is the face of a man with a very long beard who's an older man and looks to be like a sage or a wisdom figure. And whether it was a man-woman faces, or sometimes these statues were a woman, but she had a face going forward and then a face looking back. And what that depicted, the two faces, was a depiction that tried to say that if I possess prudence, I look forward always to what is the decision I have to make and what might be the consequences, but I also look backward to my history, to the reality, of the circumstances around this organization or institution. The statue of prudence is frequently depicted holding an implement in her hand. Now, I don't know what they called it in medieval times, but I call it a colander because I like to cook and I use a colander a lot for straining things. So it was something that she held in her hand that was used to strain the good from the bad, the gold from the dross, so that she could choose the right thing. The other thing she is frequently depicted, sometimes holding in her other hand, is a small, what in those days would have been called a looking glass, and was probably just some kind of a little metal where you could see a reflection, not like really a mirror today. But the notion of holding the looking glass was for self-knowledge. The idea that as I am making a decision or trying to be prudent, I have to know myself and know my own strengths and my weaknesses. Now, the next one, Kim, the Catechism of the Catholic Church defines prudence, or pardon me, the Catholic Encyclopedia, not the Catechism, defines prudence as an intellectual habit that enables us to see in any given juncture of human affairs what is virtuous and what is not. Basically, what is good and what is evil, and how to come at one, meaning the good, and to avoid the other. So it's a habit that enables us to see how we move forward to continually choose the good. All right, you can put the next one up too, Kim. This, I think, is really, really important because all of us are born with certain gifts from God or virtues, innate virtues, or instilled virtues. But if you don't have prudence, you can be courageous or brave, but without prudence, you're foolhardy. You can have mercy or compassion, but without prudence, you are weak. You can be temperate, but without prudence, you can also be fanatical. You can have a strong sense of passion or commitment, but if you don't have prudence, then you become obsessed. So prudence always seeks what Thomas Aquinas called the medium rationis, the middle path. And what Thomas said was virtus in medio stat. Virtue stands in the middle. And that is really, really important. It tries to maintain a sense of balance. Okay, the next one. Thomas also said that the function of prudence is to seek counsel for the right means to apply to a particular case. So there are some people that will say, oh, I don't consult anybody, I make decisions myself. Well, that's not really a prudent person. The prudent person does seek counsel. And the function of prudence is also to judge soundly the fitness of the means or the decision, the path suggested. And then also the function of prudence is to be able to carry it out. It's one thing to say, well, this is the best path or the way we should go. But if we don't know how to get there, we're in trouble. So, okay. Now, I'm going to move on to then these steps for ethical or discernment or decision making. And I want to be clear, these are not, I didn't just think these up outside my head. These are pretty much agreed upon steps within an ethical community. I first began to use these or to follow these from guidelines from the Hastings Center report, which is still an ethical think tank in New York. And these were developed to help physicians, families make decisions, ethical decisions about the care of their loved ones. But they apply just as well within education or social service institutions. All right, Kim. So the first step is to say, okay, really, what's the question here? Identify and clarify. And even as we talk in terms of the ethics committee that the Institute has called together and is now training members, sometimes situations will come forward and you have to say to yourself, okay, is this an ethical issue? Like, what's really the issue here? How do we determine this? So if it truly is an ethical issue, or there's a huge decision in front of you that has ethical ramifications, but it could even be a business decision. It might be about the way you're spending a certain amount of money, or if you get a bequest, which would be lovely, then how you would deal with that. So first, in the identification, or the first step, we do this within the context of prayer. It doesn't have to be long, but I think it's always important to set it there, to ask for God's guidance, just as we did in the prayer at the beginning of our meeting today. Next, we identify what is the ethical question. So try to clarify, okay, what's the issue here? And this is important, and it's important that we discuss this, because sometimes at first blush, it can seem like, all right, this is, do we keep this teacher or do we keep this student? Well, as a matter of fact, it might be something more complex than that. Have we done the job we're supposed to do to really orient people to who we are? I mean, the ethical question might be different than what is at first blush. Secondly, I think we have to state it. Whoops, did I do that? Or did you do that? I did something funny to my computer. I don't know if it's showing up on anybody else's. Okay, the slides are all of a sudden real big. My slides are big. Okay, I'll just leave it. Except I have to see it. So, all right, we have to state the situation positively and say, all right, as a school, what is the best direction in which we should move? But in some way to look at it as a positive, not a negative proposition. We clarify the decision-making authority, who's going to make this decision. And I know some of you are board members, some of you are administrators. I was on a call for the nursing home that I'm on the board today, and somebody on the call got into a discussion, and I just said, excuse me, I needed to say that I think that's not our purview. What you're describing is something in management. We can certainly discuss it or give advice, but we can't, the decision-making authority here is, in this particular case, was the administrator, not the board member. So who is the administration, or who's the decision-making authority? Is it the parents of the child? Is it the teacher? Is it the administrator, or is it the board? And then the last one ties into that, is your role in this process consultative or deliberative? In other words, are you the decision maker or are you simply being consulted? And both of those are important roles, but they are different. All right, you can move it on. Now, I'm really sorry that I don't know what I did to myself here. Well, let me see, full screen. I don't want, maybe if I do, what does this say? Share content only. Well, I'm afraid to mess it up. So I think so the next question is, who are the stakeholders? And this question is important as well, because if you're faced with a decision, again, it might come to you from parents or it could come from you indirectly through a student. But whoever brings the question or the challenge to you is not the only people involved. There are relevant stakeholders. There are the teachers, or other faculty members, there's administration, there's the board of directors, there are the sponsors, there's the reputation of the organization itself, and we need to be conscious of those persons as we make decisions. It might even be, I mean, in one sense, some of the stakeholders are people that we don't even know because they may be future students. But as we gather together in decision making, how are we conscious of them? How are their voices represented in the group that is gathered? And the picture that I have there, which is a pretty weird looking picture, is a picture of a Greek tragedy, and it's the chorus in a Greek tragedy. And if any of you have ever studied literature or know about the Greek choruses, in a Greek tragedy, the actors, or the main actors, the main protagonists, are usually fairly small number, and their voice, they are very much up to the front. And then there's always a hero. Actually, sometimes there are secondary heroines, but it's always a hero. And one of the things, many times the hero has a fatal flaw of some type or another. But one of the problems is a method that they use in Greek tragedy is that there are a group of anonymous people. Notice that their faces are all painted the same and their makeup makes them look somewhat similar, who stand off to the side, and sometimes they make comments, they chide, they try to warn the person who is the hero. One of the problems is that if the hero does not listen to this chorus, he usually comes to an unhappy end. And I think that it's one of the reasons why we need to be very attentive about who are the stakeholders. Okay, Kim. When we gather a group together or gather this information, the information that we gather does need to be multidisciplinary or multifaceted. So it's important as Catholic institutions that we look at what are the religious or ecclesial guidelines, even of our own dioceses or certainly of the church. We do need to look at legal realities. One of the cases that we dealt with in Atlanta was something about, it was about the notion of guns on a campus. Well, in the United States, how one addresses that varies depending upon the state law. So the legal reality is something that is important. The psychosocial reality of the people in front of us. We know that there are different cultures. Certainly a situation that would occur, let's say in Jamaica, would be different than that might be different than that would occur in Rhode Island. And even within the United States itself, something that would occur in San Francisco would be possibly very, very different than something that would occur in Arkansas. So that's part of the different cultural reality and the cultural mores of that particular institution or group of people that gathers together. Much of this, the gathering of information, is pre-work. And however, it's important that the pre-work is done and that the group needs to really listen to it, to review it, and to reflect upon it. It's really, really vital. So that's all I'll say. We'll talk more about this later. Kim, the next one, please. Then the next thing that you do is really to weigh what I have called here the benefits and burdens. You need to look at what are the options before us, and look at them at each of the options and say, if we do this, how will that be helpful? How will that benefit the school? How will it benefit the student or students? And then what might be the burdens if we follow this path? And then if we follow this path, what are the consequences that at least we can know now? You're never going to be able to be aware of all of the consequences, but we need to do this with each of the options, and we need to lay out the options. Usually, I think sometimes there are 2 options, sometimes there's 3 options. There can be more. And in most cases, you wouldn't be going through a discernment if there was a clear good and a clear evil. In that case, you have to choose the good. But usually it's between 2 goods, or sometimes between 2 things that are really not good, maybe not evil, but it's then how do we determine which is the best thing or the best path forward? As a mercy institution, we need to really always be aware of the poor and the vulnerable. And not all of your schools serve people that are financially poor, but there are different types of poverty and certainly different types of vulnerability. And that needs to be brought out, and it needs to be weighed. I also want to say to you, because I'm very much aware that when we speak in terms of vulnerability, sometimes even adults, the teachers or faculty members, can be vulnerable, as well as students vulnerable, and particularly in the social media age where things get posted very quickly and many times not true. And there are practical ways to ensure that we are aware of the poor and vulnerable. We can build into the decision-making process even questions that say, all right, how is this going to affect the most vulnerable members of our organization? Whether it's people with racial differences, intellectual differences, social differences, or gender differences. There's a lot of different ways that this may occur. Kim? Next, we would begin to say to ourselves, okay, as we look at these options, what are the moral principles and commitments and values to which we really are committed? And so sometimes it becomes very clear, well, we're not going to go down this path. Then we have to realize that even our moral principles, our faith principles, our doctrinal principles can have what I would call neuralgic points. And I'll give you some cases. But I mean, on the one hand, the church says, well, divorce and remarriage are not acceptable. So what does that mean then if we have a teacher that is divorced and remarried or has remarried? So that this can be something that is very, very difficult, particularly when that person has a history with the place and is well loved. And so sometimes we need to consider priorities between and among these different values that we hold dear. And in healthcare, I would see this sometimes. I mean, I can remember one case in healthcare where I dealt, there was a situation where we were concerned over the physician, but also this physician was working with a very financially elderly and poor population. And we said we have a commitment to the vulnerable. Both the physician and the patients are vulnerable. But in this case, we felt that the patients were more vulnerable than was he. Okay, the next one. At some point in this process, and I think this is a good time, when we've looked at the options, when we have tried to weigh the benefits and the burdens of the different options, then I think we need to take some time for prayer. And that prayer, you can do this in different ways. If the decision, if your people are not like pounding at your door and you can put off the decision for a day or two. Sometimes it's good to say, all right, we've really talked about this. I want to invite each of you to go home and think about this and pray about it, and we will get together in 2 days to discuss this again. Now that's maybe a luxury. So sometimes it simply means saying, let's take a 10-minute break or a 15-minute break. I invite you to either stay here and be quiet, or to go to chapel, or whatever it is that the person can do to gather him or herself to try to touch into your own center to say, where is it that I believe I am being led? But that time for prayer is really important and is part of the discernment process. Next. Then at that point, what we're trying to do is work toward a consensus in the consulting group. So we're hoping that we can at least listen to where each person is. So you invite each person to say where they are in their decision. I'm leaning in this way or whatever. And frequently, let's say you have 6 people there or 7 people there, sometimes in listening to one another, what I would do would be invite them to say simply, where are you leaning and why? Can you give us one reason why you are leaning that way? Because I think the reasons are important. So invite each person to state where they are. And something that I will say is that 100% consensus is not necessarily, or consensus is not necessarily unanimity or 100%. One of the things is I can sometimes listen and say, well, 7 of us here, and I'm the only one that's not leaning in this direction, but having listened to the reasons, I can live with and support where I believe the group is moving. So consensus is something that needs to be worked at. I've learned that particularly from the Quakers, and Quakers are much more strict about it really than are Catholics. And if they don't have consensus, frequently they just don't do anything. They don't act or don't come to a decision. Okay, Kim, next one. After that, I think it's time for the group to sort of evaluate the process and say, okay, how has this process been helpful? Has it been helpful for you to listen to one another? And then later at a subsequent meeting, if this is like a senior team or something, take a brief time for afterthoughts. We made this decision, 2 weeks ago, a recommendation, and we're not revisiting it. This is not Monday morning quarterbacking, but as you have thought about it, are there anything you've learned or anything that you would like to highlight or comment? And then it is important for you as a school or administration institution to keep a record of such decisions. And I'll talk about that a little bit. You can move to the next one because the next one also mentions that. It's important then that once the consensus is reached or the decision or recommendation, that you develop a communication plan of how are we going to explain this? What words are we going to use? How are we going to proceed? And this is more than just an elevator speech. It's important for you to articulate the context of the decision, to say that this was done within a prayerful context and over a period of seeking a great deal of advice. You have to articulate the reasons for the decision, and it doesn't mean every single reason. Sometimes, especially if it's a student situation involved, you need to maintain confidentiality, but you can still say, having consulted with the students involved, with the parents, having considered the context or whatever, these are the reasons for our decision. You have to be prepared for publicity. In this day and age, I think it is really important for you to have recourse in some way to someone who is involved in public relations, because what I have seen, and I saw this most often in healthcare, but I think administrators in education are the same way. Sometimes it's very clear to the administrator where we should proceed or how we should proceed. But then the newspaper calls them and they try to explain it, and it ends up sounding really either stupid or offensive. We don't want to do any of those things. So you need to be prepared for publicity. And this is where I think you need to have kind of an elevator speech. Here's what I'm going to say, and I'm not going to say any more. I'm not going to get sucked into saying more. Then you need to speak to the relevant stakeholders. I mean, once the decision is made, sometimes it means contacting or bringing these parents in again, talking to the teachers or the students, and following through so that people know that the concern that was expressed was clearly heard. Kim, next one. Finally, all right, I will stop there.